You think you know what poverty means? You complain about rent prices, about student loans, about the cost of groceries. You scroll through your phone, safe in your heated apartment, ordering food with the tap of your finger. But tonight, while you're comfortable in your ignorance, I'm going to show you what it really meant to be poor in ancient Rome. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a homeless person the same way again. You'll understand that our modern safety nets, our social programs, our basic human dignity, they're luxuries that most of humanity never dreamed of. Picture this. It's dawn in Rome, 150 AD. The sun hasn't risen yet, but the city is already choking on its own breath. You're standing in the Suburra, Rome's most notorious slum, where the stench of human waste mixed with rotting food and unwashed bodies creates a cocktail of misery that would make you vomit within seconds. The buildings around you tower 7, 8 stories high, built so cheaply and hastily that they sway in the wind like drunken giants. These aren't homes. They're death traps wrapped in wood and mud brick, packed with the desperate poor like sardines in a can that's about to explode. Here's what your history teacher never told you. Rome was a city of over 1 million people, and at least 400,000 of them lived in conditions that would make modern slums look like luxury resorts. The rich Romans? They lived in sprawling villas with heated floors, running water, and marble statues. The poor? They lived in what were called insulae, apartment blocks that were essentially vertical favelas, where a single room might house an entire family, their animals, and sometimes even their dead. You want to know how cruel Roman poverty was? Now, let me tell you about the babies. In Rome, if you were poor and had a baby you couldn't afford, you didn't take it to an adoption agency. You took it to the local dump and left it there to die. This wasn't illegal. This wasn't even frowned upon. It was so common that scavengers would patrol these dumps, not looking for food, but for babies they could raise as slaves. The lucky ones died quickly from exposure. The unlucky ones were found by people who saw them as future property, raised just healthy enough to work, then sold to the highest bidder. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Roman law had something called patria potestas, which gave the father absolute power over his children. If you were poor and your child was born with any deformity, any sign of weakness, any hint that they might be a burden, you could legally kill them, not just abandon them, kill them with your bare hands. And the state would thank you for not wasting resources on the weak. The women had it worse. If you were a poor woman in Rome, your body wasn't your own. It belonged to whatever man could afford to rent it. Prostitution wasn't just legal, it was considered a necessary public service. Poor women were forced into brothels so small they were called cellae, cells, because that's exactly what they were. Stone boxes barely large enough for a mattress, where women would service up to 20 men a day. The brothels were marked with stone penises pointing the way, because even the architecture was designed to dehumanize them. And if you think that was the worst of it, you're wrong. The truly desperate poor, the ones who couldn't even afford a cell in a brothel, would sell themselves to the gladiator schools. Not to become gladiators, that was for slaves and criminals. No, they would sell themselves to be killed for entertainment. They would sign contracts, legal documents, agreeing to be torn apart by wild animals in the arena, for a few coins, just enough to buy their family a meal. The food? Let me paint you a picture of what the poor ate. While the rich feasted on peacock and imported delicacies, the poor survived on something called pulse, a gray, lumpy porridge made from whatever grain was cheapest that day. Sometimes it was barley, sometimes it was millet, sometimes it was ground acorns. It had the consistency of wet cement, and about as much nutritional value. Most poor Romans ate this gray slop twice a day if they were lucky, once a day if they weren't. The taste? Imagine licking a stone that's been sitting in dirty water for a week. But here's the truly twisted part. The Roman government knew exactly how to keep the poor from revolting. They gave them just enough bread to survive and just enough entertainment to stay distracted. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The poor would line up for hours to get their daily ration of bread, then spend the rest of the day watching people die in the arena. They were too hungry to fight, too exhausted to organize, too entertained to think. The apartments where the poor lived were architectural nightmares. No running water, no heating, no windows on the lower floors. The lucky ones lived on the ground floor where at least they could escape when the building caught fire. And they did catch fire, constantly. These insulae were built with wood and mud brick, heated by open flames, and packed with people cooking, working, and living in spaces barely large enough for one person. When they burned fast and hot, turning entire blocks into funeral pyres. The poor who lived on the upper floors faced a choice every night. Risk burning to death in their sleep, or risk falling to their death from windows without glass, without barriers, without anything to stop a restless sleeper from tumbling 7 stories onto the stone street below. The morning streets of Rome were regularly littered with bodies of people who had simply fallen out of their apartments during the night. And the smell. God, the smell. With no sewage system for the poor, human waste was collected in clay pots and either dumped out the windows onto the street below or carried to public dumping grounds. The streets were rivers of filth, flowing with urine, feces, rotting food, and dead animals. The poor walked through this every day. their feet wrapped in rags, their children playing in streets that were essentially open sewers. Disease was a constant companion. Plague, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, they swept through the poor districts like clockwork. But here's the thing that will make your skin crawl. The rich Romans had a theory about why the poor got sick so often. They believed that poverty was a moral failing, that the gods punished the wicked with disease and hunger. So when plague hit the slums, the wealthy didn't see it as a tragedy. They saw it as divine justice. The poor had no doctors, no medicine, no hope of treatment. When they got sick, they either recovered on their own or they died. Usually they died. The average life expectancy for a poor Roman was around 25 years. Not because they were old and frail at 25, but because by that age, most of them had already been worked to death, starved to death, or killed by disease. But this history didn't die with the fall of Rome. The next time you walk past a homeless person, remember Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who wrote about virtue and wisdom while stepping over the bodies of the poor, and realize how little has changed. We still have our bread and circuses, our ways of keeping the desperate just comfortable enough to stay quiet. If anything has changed at all, the Roman Empire fell over 1,500 years ago, but the machinery of keeping the poor, powerless, desperate, and invisible, that's still running perfectly. We've just learned to make it look more civilized. But strip away the modern veneer, and you'll find the same cold calculation, the same systematic cruelty, the same willingness to sacrifice human dignity for the comfort of the few. The question isn't whether we're better than the Romans. The question is whether we're honest enough to admit we're not. You thought the breadlines were bad? You thought living in a 7-story death trap was the worst thing that could happen to a poor Roman? Let me tell you about the jobs. Because in Rome, if you were poor, you didn't just struggle to survive. You were forced to participate in your own destruction, to become complicit in the very system that was grinding you into dust. And the jobs available to the poor weren't just degrading. They were designed to strip away every last shred of human dignity until you became something less than human in the eyes of society. Picture this. You're a poor Roman man, maybe 16 years old, and you need work. You can't read. You can't write. You have no skills, except the ability to lift heavy things and follow orders. So you go to the docks, where ships arrive daily loaded with grain from Egypt, wild animals from Africa, and slaves from every corner of the empire. Your job? You're a sack carrier. You spend 12 hours a day, bent double under the Mediterranean sun, carrying 200-pound sacks of grain from the ships to the warehouses. The weight crushes your spine, the dust fills your lungs, and the overseers whip you if you slow down. But here's the part that will make your stomach turn. You're not just carrying grain, you're carrying human cargo. When slave ships arrived, the Sicarii were the ones who had to carry the dead slaves off the ships. Men, women, children who had died during the voyage, their bodies rotting in the Mediterranean heat. You would carry them like sacks of grain, stack them like cordwood, and dump them in mass graves outside the city. The smell would stick to your clothes, your skin, your hair. You would go home to your family reeking of death, and the next day you would do it again. The women had even fewer choices. If you were a poor woman who couldn't afford to sell your body, you could work in the phalanakae, the laundries. But Roman laundries weren't like modern dry cleaners. They were chemical warfare facilities disguised as businesses. The Romans cleaned clothes by soaking them in human urine, then having workers stomp on them barefoot for hours. The ammonia would eat through your skin, leaving permanent chemical burns on your feet and legs. The fumes would destroy your lungs, leaving you gasping for air that never seemed to come. And the urine? It wasn't just collected from public toilets. Poor women would go door to door in the wealthy neighborhoods, begging for permission to collect urine from private homes. They would carry clay pots filled with the waste of the rich, balanced on their heads, walking miles through the city to deliver it to the laundries. The wealthy would pay them a few coins for this service, not because they needed the money, but because they enjoyed the humiliation of watching poor women beg for their waste. But if you really want to understand the cruelty of Roman poverty, let me tell you about the child workers. Roman law had no minimum age for employment. Children as young as 5 years old were put to work in jobs that would kill grown men. In the mines, children were used as human canaries, sent into tunnels to test for poisonous gases. If they came back alive, the tunnel was safe. If they didn't, well, there were always more children. The pottery workshops were worse. Children were forced to work with lead glazes, mixing them with their bare hands, breathing in the toxic fumes for 14 hours a day. The lead would accumulate in their bodies, causing brain damage, paralysis, and eventually death. But before they died, they would go insane. The workshops were filled with children who would laugh uncontrollably, speak in tongues, or attack their co-workers without warning. The Romans called it the potter's madness, and they thought it was caused by evil spirits. The construction sites were human meat grinders. Poor men and children were used as expendable labor to build the monuments that we still admire today. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Forum, they're all built on the bones of the poor. Workers would die daily from falls, cave-ins, and accidents. But here's the truly horrifying part. The Romans kept detailed records of these deaths, not out of concern for the workers, but because they needed to know how many replacement workers to buy. Yes, buy. Because if you were poor in Rome and you got injured on the job, you didn't get medical care. You got sold. Roman law allowed employers to sell injured workers to recoup their losses. A man who lost his arm in a construction accident would be sold to a gladiator school. A woman who was burned in a laundry would be sold to a brothel. Children who were poisoned in the mines would be sold to whoever would take them, usually to be worked to death in even more dangerous jobs. The entertainment industry was a special kind of hell. Poor people weren't just the audience for Roman spectacles, they were the raw material. The beast hunts in the arena required a constant supply of condemned criminals, but Rome didn't have enough criminals to satisfy the bloodlust of the crowds. So they created them. Poor people were arrested for increasingly minor offenses, tried in kangaroo courts and sentenced to death in the arena. Stealing a loaf of bread, death by lion. Begging without a permit, death by crucifixion. Looking at a wealthy Roman the wrong way, death by gladiator. The legal system became a harvesting operation, turning the poor into entertainment for the rich, and the poor knew it. They knew that any day, any interaction with the authorities, any moment of desperation could result in a death sentence designed to amuse the masses. The funeral industry was built on the backs of the poor. When wealthy Romans died, they were given elaborate funerals with professional mourners, musicians, and dancers, but the poor provided the raw material for these spectacles. Poor women were hired to cry at funerals, to wail and tear their hair and beat their chests. They were paid a few coins to perform grief for people they had never met, to mourn deaths that meant nothing to them while their own families died in poverty. Poor men were hired to carry the bodies of the rich through the streets, to hold up the heavy funeral beds while the wealthy mourned. If they stumbled, if they showed any sign of weakness, they would be beaten in front of the funeral procession. The mourning of the rich was built on the suffering of the poor, and everyone knew it. The religious system was equally corrupt. The temples needed constant maintenance, and the poor were forced to provide it. But temple work wasn't just cleaning and repair. The poor were used as human sacrifices in religious ceremonies. Not officially, of course. The Romans were too civilized for that. But poor people who died during temple construction were often declared to be blessed by the gods. Their deaths transformed into religious events that sanctified the building process. The tax system was designed to extract every last coin from the poor. Tax collectors were given quotas, and if they couldn't collect enough money from the wealthy, they would make up the difference by squeezing the poor. Poor families would be forced to sell their children to pay taxes they couldn't afford. The children would be taken away in chains, sold to slave dealers, and the parents would never see them again. But here's the most twisted part. The Romans convinced the poor that this was all their fault, that poverty was a moral failing, that suffering was divine punishment, that the rich were blessed by the gods and the poor were cursed. The poor believed it. They internalized their own oppression, blamed themselves for their circumstances, and taught their children to accept their fate. The system didn't just exploit the poor, it broke them psychologically, turning them into willing participants in their own destruction. They would compete with each other for the most degrading jobs, betray their neighbors for a few extra coins, and sell their own children rather than fight back against the system that was destroying them. But this psychological manipulation didn't end with Rome. The next time you hear someone say that poor people are lazy, that they deserve their fate, that they should just work harder, remember the Roman tax collectors who convinced families to sell their children. And realize that the same lies are still being told today, just with different words. You think you've heard the worst of it? You think carrying dead slaves and working with toxic chemicals was the bottom of the pit? Let me tell you about Roman medicine and what it meant to be sick and poor in the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Because in Rome, if you were poor and you got sick, you didn't just face death. You faced something far worse. You became a laboratory rat for the rich, a test subject for treatments that were designed not to heal you, but to perfect techniques that would later be used on people who actually mattered. The Roman medical system was built on a simple principle. The poor were expendable practice material for doctors learning their trade. If you were wealthy and fell ill, you would be treated by experienced physicians using proven methods. If you were poor and fell ill, you would be treated by medical students using experimental techniques that had never been tested on humans before. And I mean never. The first time they tried a new surgical procedure, the first time they tested a new drug, the first time they attempted a new treatment, they tried it on you. Picture this. You're a poor Roman with a broken leg. A wealthy Roman with the same injury would have his leg set by a skilled doctor wrapped in clean bandages and given opium for the pain. You would be taken to a medical school where students would practice setting bones. They would break your leg again just to see if they could set it better. They would try different techniques, different tools, different approaches. Some students would succeed, most would fail. And you would be conscious for all of it because anesthesia was expensive and you weren't worth the cost. The surgical amphitheaters were built for this purpose. Just like the gladiatorial arenas, they had tiers of seats where spectators could watch the action below. But instead of watching men fight to the death, they watched poor people being dissected alive. Medical students would gather around as their instructors demonstrated new procedures on living subjects. The poor would be strapped down, unable to move, while doctors cut into their bodies to show students how organs worked, how blood flowed, how nerves responded to stimulation. And here's what will make your blood run cold. These weren't quick procedures. A single demonstration could last for hours, with the subject kept alive and conscious throughout. The doctors would explain each step, point out anatomical features, discuss theoretical approaches, all while the poor person on the table screamed and begged for death. The students would take notes, ask questions, and practice techniques on the same living body until it finally gave out from shock and blood loss. The pharmaceutical industry was equally brutal. Roman doctors needed to test new drugs and treatments, but they couldn't risk the lives of wealthy patients. So they used the poor as human guinea pigs. New poisons were tested on poor prisoners to determine lethal doses. New antidotes were tested on poor people who had been deliberately poisoned. New surgical techniques were practiced on poor people who had been deliberately injured. The contraceptive industry was particularly horrific. Roman women needed birth control, but only wealthy women could afford the safe, tested methods. Poor women were used to test experimental contraceptives that often resulted in permanent sterility, internal bleeding, or death. The doctors would deliberately impregnate poor women, then test different methods of terminating the pregnancy. They would try different drugs, different procedures, different timing, all to perfect techniques that would later be offered to wealthy clients. The mental health system was pure nightmare fuel. The Romans believed that mental illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, and they treated it by trying to restore balance through extreme measures. If you were poor and showed signs of mental illness, you would be used to test treatments that included drilling holes in your skull, removing pieces of your brain, and injecting foreign substances directly into your nervous system. The trepanation procedures were the worst. Poor people with headaches, seizures, or mood disorders would have holes drilled in their skulls while they were fully conscious. The doctors would use these procedures to study brain function, poking at different areas to see how the patient responded. They would remove pieces of brain tissue, inject irritants, and even insert foreign objects to see what would happen. The mortality rate was nearly 100%, but the knowledge gained was invaluable for treating wealthy patients with similar conditions. The dental industry was equally savage. Poor people with tooth problems were used to test new extraction techniques, new tools, and new approaches to oral surgery. Dentists would deliberately damage healthy teeth to practice their procedures. They would remove all of a poor person's teeth, not because it was medically necessary, but because they needed to practice full mouth extractions. The poor would be left unable to eat solid food, condemned to a slow death by starvation. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. The Romans kept detailed medical records of these experiments. They documented which procedures worked, which ones failed, which ones caused the most suffering. These records were used to refine techniques, improve outcomes, and develop better treatments. But only for the wealthy. The knowledge gained from torturing the poor was used exclusively to benefit the rich. The public health system was designed to protect the wealthy from diseases that were allowed to run rampant among the poor. When plague hit the slums, the authorities would quarantine the entire district, trapping the poor inside with the disease while the wealthy neighborhoods remained protected. The poor would die by the thousands, but their deaths provided valuable information about disease transmission, progression, and treatment. The quarantine areas became open-air laboratories, where doctors would study disease without interference. They would observe how illnesses spread, how they affected different age groups, how they responded to different treatments. The poor were unwilling test subjects in medical experiments that would inform public health policy for centuries to come. The military medical system was equally brutal. Poor soldiers were used to test battlefield medicine, new surgical techniques, and experimental treatments for combat injuries. Doctors would deliberately wound poor soldiers to practice treating battle injuries. They would test new ways of amputating limbs, new methods of treating infections, new approaches to trauma surgery. The soldiers would be told they were participating in training exercises, but they were actually being used as human test subjects. The rehabilitation system was designed to extract maximum value from damaged bodies. Poor people who were injured in industrial accidents weren't given medical care to help them recover. They were given just enough treatment to keep them alive, while doctors studied their injuries. The goal wasn't healing, it was understanding. Doctors wanted to know how the human body responded to different types of trauma, how it adapted to permanent disabilities, how it could be modified to remain productive despite severe injuries. The organ harvesting industry was already well established. When poor people died, their bodies weren't buried or cremated. They were dissected, their organs removed and preserved for medical study. The freshest organs were used for transplant experiments, where doctors would practice moving organs from one body to another. The success rate was essentially zero, but the knowledge gained was invaluable for developing techniques that would later be used on wealthy patients. The reproductive health system was particularly twisted. Poor women were used to study pregnancy, childbirth, and infant development. They would be subjected to experimental procedures during pregnancy, forced to give birth under observation, and have their babies taken away immediately after birth for medical study. The goal was to understand human development, but the cost was measured in destroyed lives and murdered children. The pediatric medical system was pure horror. Poor children were used to study childhood diseases, test new treatments, and develop age-appropriate medical procedures. They would be deliberately infected with diseases, subjected to experimental surgeries, and used as test subjects for new drugs. The mortality rate was staggering, but the knowledge gained was used to develop pediatric medicine that would benefit wealthy children for generations. But here's the most twisted part. The Romans convinced themselves that this was morally justified. They believed that the poor were naturally inferior, that their suffering was divinely ordained, that using them for medical experiments was actually a form of charity. They told themselves that the poor were contributing to the greater good, that their deaths served a higher purpose, that their pain was necessary for medical progress. This medical apartheid didn't die with Rome. The next time you read about medical breakthroughs, about new treatments and miracle cures, remember the Roman medical students practicing surgery on living subjects. And ask yourself, how many of our modern medical advances were built on the suffering of people who had no choice but to endure them? You think the medical experiments were the depths of Roman cruelty? You think being used as a human guinea pig was the worst fate that could befall a poor person in the empire? Let me tell you about the legal system, about what it meant to seek justice when you had no money, no connections, no voice. Because in Rome, the law wasn't blind. It had perfect vision, and it was laser-focused on protecting the wealthy while grinding the poor into legal dust. The Roman legal system was built on a simple principle that would make your modern sense of justice recoil in horror. Your worth as a human being was determined by your wealth, not your actions, not your character, not your innocence or guilt, your bank account. If you were rich, you were presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. If you were poor, you were presumed guilty until you could prove your innocence, which was impossible because you couldn't afford the evidence, the witnesses, or the lawyers needed to mount a defense. Picture this. You're a poor Roman accused of stealing a wealthy man's purse. The evidence against you is flimsy at best, maybe just the word of a single witness who claims to have seen you near the scene. In a modern court, this wouldn't be enough to convict anyone. But in Rome, the burden of proof was reversed. You had to prove you didn't steal the purse, not the other way around. And how do you prove a negative when you can't afford investigators, when you can't hire witnesses, when you can't even afford a lawyer to represent you? The Roman legal system had different punishments for the same crime depending on your social class. If a wealthy Roman was convicted of theft, he would pay a fine and maybe face some social embarrassment. If a poor Roman was convicted of the same crime, he would be crucified, not metaphorically, literally nailed to a cross and left to die over the course of several days. The same crime, the same evidence, the same court, but completely different outcomes based solely on how much money you had. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. The Romans didn't just punish the poor more harshly, they criminalized poverty itself. Being homeless was a crime. Begging was a crime. Not having visible means of support was a crime. The poor were trapped in a legal system that punished them for being poor, then punished them even more harshly for the crimes they committed trying to survive their poverty. The court system was designed to extract confessions through torture. If you were poor and accused of a crime, you would be taken to a basement beneath the courthouse where professional torturers would work on you with instruments that had been perfected over centuries of use. They had tools specifically designed to cause maximum pain without causing immediate death. The goal wasn't to kill you quickly, it was to keep you alive and conscious while they slowly destroyed your body until you confessed to whatever they wanted you to confess to. The confession extracted under torture was considered more reliable than any other form of evidence. Roman legal theory held that pain was the ultimate truth serum, that no one could lie while experiencing extreme physical suffering. So the torture wasn't just punishment, it was investigation. The more you screamed, the more honest you were presumed to be. The more you begged for mercy, the more credible your confession became. The wealthy had a completely different legal experience. They were never tortured. They were never presumed guilty. They had access to the best lawyers, the most skilled rhetoricians, the most convincing advocates. They could buy witnesses, bribe judges, and manipulate juries. They could delay trials until evidence disappeared, until witnesses died, until public attention moved on to other matters. The jury system was rigged from the beginning. Jurors were selected from the wealthy classes, people who had a vested interest in maintaining the system that kept them on top. They didn't see poor defendants as fellow human beings. They saw them as dangerous animals that needed to be controlled. A poor person standing trial wasn't seeking justice. They were being processed by a machine designed to remove them from society. The appeals process was available only to those who could afford it. If you were convicted of a crime, you could appeal to a higher court, but only if you could pay the fees, hire new lawyers, and wait months or years for your case to be heard. The poor had no such option. Their convictions were final, their sentences immediate, their fates sealed the moment they were accused. But here's the most twisted part. The Romans turned the legal system into entertainment. Public trials were spectacles, with crowds gathering to watch poor people be humiliated, tortured, and condemned. The wealthy would attend these trials like they were theatrical performances, cheering for the prosecutors and jeering at the defendants. The suffering of the poor became a form of public amusement. a way for the rich to feel superior while watching others be destroyed. The prison system was designed not to rehabilitate, but to torment. Roman prisons were underground chambers where the poor were chained to walls and left to rot. They were given just enough food to keep them alive, just enough water to prevent immediate death from dehydration. The goal wasn't to prepare them for eventual release. It was to break them psychologically before they were executed. The conditions in these prisons were deliberately horrific. Prisoners were kept in complete darkness, surrounded by their own waste, with no human contact, except when guards came to deliver food or extract prisoners for execution. Many went insane long before their sentences were carried out. Some begged to be executed immediately rather than continue living in these conditions. The death penalty was reserved almost exclusively for the poor. Wealthy Romans who committed capital crimes could usually buy their way out of execution through fines, exile, or political connections. The poor had no such options. They were executed quickly and efficiently, their deaths serving as warnings to other poor people about the consequences of challenging the system. The methods of execution were specifically designed to maximize suffering and public spectacle. Crucifixion was the most common form of execution for the poor, but it wasn't the only one. They were also burned alive, fed to wild animals, forced to fight gladiators, or subjected to creative tortures that had been designed specifically for public entertainment. The families of executed prisoners were often punished as well. The Romans believed that criminality was hereditary, that the children of criminals would inevitably become criminals themselves. So they would execute entire families, not just the person who had been convicted. Children would be killed for crimes their parents had committed. Wives would be executed for their husbands' actions, and parents would be punished for their children's mistakes. The civil court system was equally biased. If you were poor and had a dispute with a wealthy person, you could technically take them to court, but the outcome was predetermined. The wealthy could afford better lawyers, more convincing witnesses, and more impressive evidence. They could also afford to drag out the proceedings until the poor person ran out of money and was forced to drop the case. The contract system was designed to trap the poor in permanent debt. Wealthy Romans would offer loans to poor people at reasonable interest rates, but the contracts were written in legal language that the poor couldn't understand. Hidden clauses would allow the lender to change the terms, increase the interest rate, or demand immediate payment under certain conditions. The poor would sign these contracts thinking they were getting help, but they were actually signing away their freedom. When poor people inevitably defaulted on these loans, they would be taken to debtors' courts, where they would be sentenced to work off their debt as slaves. But the terms of this slavery were designed to ensure that the debt could never be repaid. The poor would work for years, sometimes decades, generating wealth for their creditors, while their debt continued to grow through accumulated interest and fees. The inheritance system was rigged to prevent poor families from accumulating wealth across generations. Poor people who managed to save money or acquire property would find their assets seized by the state upon their death, supposedly to pay for unpaid taxes or outstanding debts. Their children would inherit nothing but poverty, ensuring that the cycle continued indefinitely. But here's what will make your skin crawl. The Romans convinced themselves that this legal system was fair, that it represented the pinnacle of civilized justice. They wrote extensively about the rule of law, about the importance of legal procedures, about the necessity of due process. They genuinely believed that they had created a just society, even as they systematically oppressed and murdered the poor. This legal apartheid didn't disappear with the Roman Empire. The next time you read about mandatory minimum sentences, about cash bail systems, about public defenders with impossible caseloads, remember the Roman torture chambers beneath the courthouse. And ask yourself, how much have we really changed? You think the legal system was the final horror? You think being tortured for confessions and executed for entertainment was the ultimate cruelty? Let me tell you about Roman slavery, about what it meant to be property in the greatest civilization the world had ever seen. Because slavery in Rome wasn't just about forced labor. It was about the complete and systematic destruction of human identity, the reduction of living beings to objects that could be bought, sold, modified, and discarded at will. But here's the part that will shatter your understanding of Roman society. Most slaves weren't captured in wars or born into bondage. They were poor Romans who had been transformed into property by the economic system itself. Debt slavery was the engine that fed the Roman slave machine, and it was designed to convert the poor into commodities through a process so gradual, so seemingly legal, that the victims often didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Picture this. You're a poor Roman farmer who has fallen behind on your taxes. The government offers you a deal. Work off your debt as a temporary slave, and you'll be free once the debt is paid. It seems reasonable, even generous. But the contract is written in legal language you can't understand, and it contains clauses that ensure you'll never be free. The interest on your debt compounds daily. You're charged for your food, your housing, your work tools. You're fined for working too slowly, for getting sick, for any infraction the overseer can imagine. Within months, your debt is tripled. Within a year, it's impossible to calculate. You're no longer a temporary slave working off a debt. You're a permanent property, and your children will be born into slavery to pay off the debt you can never repay. The Romans had perfected the art of making slavery look like a voluntary economic arrangement, a business transaction that just happened to involve human beings. The slave markets were architectural marvels of human degradation. They were designed like modern shopping malls, with different sections for different types of human merchandise. There were areas for agricultural slaves, for domestic slaves, for skilled craftsmen, for entertainment slaves. Each section had specialized dealers who could evaluate human beings like livestock, checking their teeth, their muscles, their reproductive capacity, their psychological fitness for different types of work. The inspection process was designed to be as humiliating as possible. Potential slaves would be stripped naked and forced to perform various tasks to demonstrate their abilities. They would be made to run, to lift heavy objects, to demonstrate their skills. Women would be examined for their fertility, their physical attractiveness, their suitability for different types of sexual service. Children would be tested for their intelligence, their trainability, their potential for different types of specialized work. But here's what will make your blood run cold. The Romans developed scientific methods for breaking human beings psychologically. They understood that physical punishment alone wasn't enough to maintain control over large populations of slaves. They needed to destroy the slaves' sense of self, to convince them that they were naturally inferior, that slavery was their proper place in the world. The process began with renaming. When you became a slave, you lost your name, your identity, your connection to your past. You were given a new name that reflected your function, your origin, or your owner's whim. You were no longer Marcus the farmer or Julia the weaver. You were Rusticus the field hand or Tessera the house slave. Your old identity was erased, replaced with a designation that marked you as property. The clothing system was designed to dehumanize slaves and make them instantly recognizable as property. Slaves were required to wear specific types of clothing that marked their status, their function, and their owner. They couldn't wear the same colors as free citizens, couldn't wear certain fabrics, couldn't adorn themselves with jewelry or other decorations. Their appearance was regulated to ensure that they were visually distinct from human beings. The housing system was designed to prevent slaves from forming meaningful relationships or maintaining family bonds. Slaves were housed in barracks-style buildings where privacy was impossible, where personal possessions were forbidden, where family members were deliberately separated. Children were taken from their parents at young ages and housed separately, preventing the formation of family bonds that might interfere with their loyalty to their owners. The work system was designed to exhaust slaves physically and mentally, to keep them too tired to think about resistance or escape. Slaves worked from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, with no breaks, no holidays, no rest periods. They were given just enough food to maintain their strength, just enough sleep to prevent immediate collapse, just enough medical care to keep them productive. The punishment system was designed to terrorize not just the individual slave being punished, but all the slaves who witnessed the punishment. Public floggings were common, but they were just the beginning. Slaves who attempted to escape would be crucified in front of their fellow slaves. Slaves who showed signs of rebellion would be fed to wild animals. Slaves who tried to organize resistance would be subjected to creative tortures that had been designed specifically to break the will of other slaves. The breeding system was designed to produce new generations of slaves who would be psychologically conditioned to accept their bondage. Female slaves were used as breeding stock, forced to produce children who would become the property of their mother's owner. These children were raised in slavery from birth, never knowing freedom, never experiencing life as anything other than property. The education system for slave children was designed to train them for specific functions while preventing them from developing any sense of self-worth or independence. Slave children were taught skills that would make them valuable property, but they were also taught that they were naturally inferior, that slavery was their proper place in the world, that resistance was futile and sinful. The manumission system was designed to give slaves false hope while maintaining control over them. Slaves could theoretically earn their freedom through good behavior, exceptional service, or by purchasing themselves from their owners. But the requirements were designed to be nearly impossible to meet. A slave would need to save money while earning no wages, demonstrate perfect obedience while maintaining their humanity, and convince their owner to give up valuable property for purely altruistic reasons. The few slaves who did achieve manumission found that freedom was largely illusory. Freed slaves remained legally bound to their former owners, required to provide services and support for the rest of their lives. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, couldn't marry free citizens without permission. Their children would be born free, but they would carry the stigma of slave ancestry for generations. The sexual exploitation of slaves was considered a natural right of ownership. Male and female slaves had no legal right to refuse sexual demands from their owners' friends, or anyone else their owner chose to grant access to. Slave women were used as concubines, prostitutes, and breeding stock. Slave men were used for sexual entertainment, forced to perform in ways that degraded and humiliated them. The medical exploitation of slaves was extensive. Slaves were used as test subjects for new medical procedures, as practice materials for trainee doctors, as donors for organ transplants and blood transfusions. Their bodies were considered property that could be modified, damaged, or destroyed at will. Slave children were used in medical experiments that would have been considered torture if performed on free citizens. The entertainment industry was built on slave labor and slave suffering. Gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical performances, and public spectacles all depended on slaves who were forced to risk their lives for the amusement of others. Slaves were trained to fight, to perform, to die in ways that would entertain the masses. Their deaths were choreographed, their suffering was commodified, their humanity was erased in service of public entertainment. The domestic slavery system was designed to invade every aspect of private life. Wealthy Romans owned hundreds of domestic slaves who served their every need, anticipated their every desire, and remained invisible unless needed. These slaves were required to be constantly available, constantly attentive, constantly subservient. They had no privacy, no personal time, no space that was their own. The agricultural slavery system was designed to maximize productivity while minimizing costs. Slaves worked in chain gangs, literally chained together to prevent escape, forced to work in fields under the constant supervision of overseers, who were authorized to use any level of violence necessary to maintain productivity. The mortality rate was staggering, but slaves were cheap enough that it was more economical to work them to death and buy replacements than to invest in their long-term health. But here's the most horrifying part. The Romans convinced themselves that slavery was beneficial for the slaves themselves. They argued that slaves were naturally inferior, that they needed the guidance and protection of their owners, that freedom would be cruel because slaves weren't capable of taking care of themselves. They genuinely believed that slavery was a form of charity, a way of providing for people who couldn't provide for themselves. This commodification of human beings didn't end with the Roman Empire. The next time you read about human trafficking, about forced labor, about people working for wages that can't support basic survival, remember the Roman slave markets with their scientific methods for breaking human spirits. And ask yourself, have we really abolished slavery, or have we just learned to make it look like something else? You think you understand now? You think you've seen the depths of Roman cruelty, the systematic destruction of human dignity, the machine that ground the poor into dust? Let me tell you the final secret, the one that will make everything else seem like a warm-up act. Because the most horrifying thing about Roman poverty wasn't the starvation, the disease, the slavery, or the torture. It was the religion. The way the Romans used their gods to justify every atrocity, to sanctify every cruelty, to transform human suffering into divine worship. The Roman religious system was built on a foundation of human sacrifice that was so deeply embedded in daily life that most people didn't even recognize it as sacrifice. They called it justice. They called it entertainment. They called it necessity. But what they were really doing was feeding their gods a steady diet of human blood, and the gods they fed most generously were the ones that demanded the blood of the poor. Picture this. You're standing in the Colosseum on a festival day dedicated to Mars, the god of war. The crowd is cheering as hundreds of condemned prisoners, almost all of them poor, are driven into the arena to be torn apart by wild animals. The Romans don't see this as murder. They see it as religious ceremony. Each death is an offering to the gods. Each scream is a prayer. Each drop of blood is a sacrament that ensures the favor of the divine. The religious calendar was structured around these sacrificial spectacles. Every major festival required human offerings, and the poor provided the raw material. The Romans had perfected the art of turning judicial murder into religious observance, of transforming state-sponsored terrorism into holy ritual. They convinced themselves that the gods demanded these deaths, that the empire would fall if they didn't feed their deities a constant stream of human suffering. But here's what will make your soul recoil. The Romans didn't just kill the poor for their gods, they tortured them in ways that were specifically designed to maximize the religious value of their suffering. The crucifixion wasn't just an execution method, it was a religious ritual that was meant to mirror the journey of the soul from earthly suffering to divine transcendence. The victim was meant to experience every stage of spiritual purification through physical agony. The process began with the scourging, where the victim was whipped with a cat o' nine tails embedded with pieces of bone and metal. This wasn't just punishment, it was purification. The Romans believed that physical pain burned away spiritual impurities, that suffering was a form of divine communication. The more the victim screamed, the more they were communing with the gods. The more they bled, the more they were being cleansed. The crown of thorns wasn't just mockery, it was a religious symbol representing the transformation of the victim into a sacrificial offering. The thorns were meant to pierce the skull and cause maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and aware. The blood that flowed from these wounds was considered sacred, collected by priests, and used in religious ceremonies. The nailing to the cross was done in a specific pattern that had religious significance. The nails were driven through the wrists and feet at points that would cause maximum pain while preventing the victim from dying too quickly. The goal wasn't just execution, It was prolonged suffering that would generate the maximum amount of spiritual energy for the gods. The religious authorities taught that this suffering was beneficial for the victims themselves. They claimed that the poor were being given an opportunity to transcend their earthly misery through divine pain, that their deaths were a form of spiritual promotion that would elevate them to a higher plane of existence. The victims were told that they should be grateful for the chance to suffer for the gods, that their pain was a gift that would be rewarded in the afterlife. The crowd's participation was considered essential to the religious effectiveness of the sacrifice. The cheering, the jeering, the bloodlust, it was all part of the ritual. The Romans believed that the collective energy of the crowd amplified the spiritual power of the sacrifice, that the gods were more pleased when the suffering was witnessed and celebrated by large numbers of people. The priests would move through the crowd during these spectacles, collecting money for the temples, selling religious trinkets, and offering prayers for the health and prosperity of the spectators. The suffering of the poor was literally monetized, turned into a fundraising opportunity for the religious establishment. The more people died, the more money the temples made. The gladiatorial games were the pinnacle of this religious system. What people today think of as entertainment was actually the most sacred ritual in Roman religion. The gladiators weren't just fighters, they were priests of death, sacred warriors who communed with the gods through violence. When a gladiator killed his opponent, he was performing a religious service, offering the victim's life force to the deities. The training of gladiators was a religious process. They were taught not just how to fight, but how to die in ways that would be pleasing to the gods. They learned specific death poses, specific ways of falling, specific final words that would maximize the spiritual value of their deaths. They were trained to die beautifully, to transform their final moments into works of religious art. The gladiatorial schools were temples as much as training facilities. They had altars where gladiators would pray before fights, where they would offer sacrifices to ensure victory or a good death. The weapons were blessed by priests. The armor was inscribed with religious symbols. The entire process was suffused with sacred meaning. The beast hunts were religious ceremonies that celebrated the power of nature and the gods who controlled it. The condemned prisoners who were fed to the animals weren't just being executed. They were being offered to the wild gods, the primal forces that govern the natural world. Their deaths were meant to appease these gods and ensure that the natural world would continue to serve human needs. The naval battles staged in flooded amphitheaters were religious reenactments of mythological conflicts. The prisoners who were forced to fight and die in these spectacles were playing the roles of ancient heroes and monsters, their deaths recreating the cosmic struggles that had shaped the world. The audience wasn't just watching entertainment, they were participating in the retelling of sacred stories. The public executions were religious festivals that celebrated the triumph of order over chaos, of civilization over barbarism. The condemned prisoners represented the forces of disorder that threatened the stability of the empire. Their deaths were meant to restore cosmic balance, to reassure the gods that the Roman people were still worthy of divine protection. The religious justification for all this suffering was elaborate and sophisticated. The Romans developed complex theological systems that explained why the gods demanded human sacrifice, why the poor were the most appropriate victims, why public suffering was necessary for the health of the state. They created myths and legends that portrayed the gods as bloodthirsty deities who could only be satisfied through human pain. The priests taught that the poor were naturally closer to the gods because they had been stripped of earthly attachments. Their suffering was portrayed as a form of divine communication, a way for the gods to speak directly to the Roman people. The more the poor suffered, the more the gods were pleased. The more they died, the more the empire was blessed. The religious festivals were timed to coincide with agricultural cycles, military campaigns, and political events. The Romans believed that the right amount of human sacrifice at the right time could ensure good harvests, military victories, and political stability. The poor were the fuel that powered this religious machine, their lives the currency that purchased divine favor. The temple system was built on the wealth generated by this religious economy. The priests grew rich, selling access to the gods, offering prayers for protection, providing religious services for the wealthy. The temples were filled with gold and silver purchased with the blood of the poor, decorated with artworks that celebrated their suffering, maintained by wealth that was generated by their deaths. The religious education system taught children that this was natural, that the gods had ordained this system, that questioning it was blasphemy. Children were brought to the spectacles to learn about their religious heritage, to understand their place in the cosmic order, to accept the necessity of human sacrifice for the good of society. But here's the final horror, the one that will haunt your dreams. The Romans genuinely believed that this system was moral, that it represented the highest form of civilization, that they were creating a society that was blessed by the gods. They saw themselves as the most religious people on earth, the most favored of the deities, the most civilized of all nations. They wrote philosophical treatises about the beauty of their religious system, the necessity of sacrifice, the wisdom of their gods. They created art that celebrated these spectacles, poetry that praised the victims, music that accompanied the deaths. They turned human suffering into high culture, transformed murder into art, elevated cruelty to the level of divine worship. This religious justification for systematic cruelty didn't die with the Roman Empire. The next time you hear someone say that poverty is God's will, that suffering builds character, that the poor deserve their fate because they lack moral virtue, remember the Roman priests collecting money while people died for their gods. And realize that we're still living in the shadow of those temples, still breathing the smoke of those ancient sacrifices, still participating in systems that transform human suffering into profit and call it holy. The Roman Empire fell, but the machinery of sanctified cruelty survived. We've simply learned to worship different gods, to use different words, to hide the blood behind more sophisticated rhetoric. But the essential transaction remains the same. The poor suffer, the rich profit, and we tell ourselves that it's all part of some greater plan. The question isn't whether we've moved beyond Roman barbarism. The question is whether we have the courage to admit that we never left the arena at all.